I have been documenting my journey into making stained glass. I took a single lead came stained glass class and immediately fell in love with the entire process. I went home, started ordering all the supplies I would need to make stained glass at home, but instead of the lead came version, I bought supplies for the copper foil method. These witchy ghosts were my third and fourth projects in the copper foil method, although they were so small I sort of count them as a single project. Let's talk about what I've learned through the process. One of the earliest lessons that I learned, and this is a bummer because there are so many legitimate creators out there, was to never buy patterns again. Now, this project may not seem like that big of a deal, but the project just before this one was quite literally impossible. The cuts were not even possible because there was this circle inside of another circle with no break or line to get to that inner circle, so I'm just a little bit salty, I think, for being duped more than once. Don't get me wrong, I love supporting small businesses. I have no issue with supporting someone else's work, but I ended up actually buying this pattern as well as another pattern, and both of them were impossible to create. I don't know if they're AI generated, the person who created them maybe just never actually made stained glass, or they need to start putting some sort of information on patterns that a ring saw may be required. If I have to make modifications to a pattern, I don't want to pay for it. I could spend that time just making the entire pattern on the computer with programs that I already have. I don't want to sound like a Debbie Downer, but as a complete beginner, I shouldn't have to make a modification to a pattern to actually create it. I think I would feel differently if they offered options on the pattern for modifications, but either way, I am finding that a lot of the patterns being sold are not actually possible to create. So that's my disclosure and my little rant about patterns, especially for beginners like myself. Now, these ghosts weren't actually that bad. It was just part of the hat in one of them where the cut was just not possible unless you had a ring saw. I didn't end up putting the hands on there either, so I think that those cuts would have been a little bit difficult because of how small the curves were. But it was almost like this pattern was either created to rely on your grinder or you needed a ring saw for it. Okay, hopefully I haven't lost too much interest if anyone is actually listening to this because of my little complaining session there, but I think it's really important to talk about patterns for beginners. I didn't know what I was looking for with a pattern, and even though the patterns weren't expensive, why would someone be paying for something that they had to change anyway? I don't know, maybe I'm just missing something with patterns, but from what I've been told from the online groups, from people that I know, it's mostly because they're AI generated or people are just kind of creating them and not actually making stained glass to understand that the cuts aren't possible. I will say, in the defense of the pattern, even though I stand by it not being good for somebody without a ring saw, my cutting skills were not ready for the curves. I think I could have gotten closer to the curve if I had a little bit more confidence and experience in the cuts, but I was still never going to be able to handle that sharp curve. And I do want to point out that the filming that you're seeing right now is actually not the sharp curve. That one comes in a little bit later. This one I still struggled with because I didn't understand curves and I was using my tools incorrectly, which I'll get to in a second here. But if you are watching the actual video, that is not the sharp curve that I'm referring to. I'm just really terrible at cutting my pieces as I was filming this part. I ended up deciding not to add the hands or the added features like the eyes, but that was just a personal preference. If I was gonna do this pattern ever again, I would add the eyes just because I would feel better about learning how to do that copper foil overlay. For the sake of experience, I do wish that I would have added the eyes, but overall, I like the look of them without it. I did end up breaking a lot of glass on this one. At this point, I still didn't know how to use my tools properly either. The running pliers, I would later discover, weren't actually curved, and it was just a giant Temu fail of a situation. And the grousers, I hadn't learned how to use properly with that flat side on top. So that was probably a reason that most of my glass was shattering because I wasn't actually using my tools properly. If you are new to making stained glass, learning how to use the grousers properly will make a world of difference when it comes to using them to break your glass. The flat side of your tool should be faced up or on the top and the curved part on the bottom. I also learned that tapping your glass can really improve your cuts. I'm still learning which tools work best or how to tap it in the most effective way, but especially if you're first learning how to cut and maybe not applying enough pressure or consistent pressure, tapping the glass can be the difference of a crack where you don't want it to be or saving the piece entirely. At this point, I was still using sticker paper. I was testing out to see if vinyl was something I wanted to invest in. There were some perks to using the adhesive paper, especially when it came to grinding. It stuck a lot better than the marker, which was another lesson that I learned about. You should be using an oil-based and a fine tip marker, which will stay on a lot better when you're grinding. Although, if I'm being completely honest, there are certain glass types that are so smooth it won't matter if it's oil or water based and it's just going to rub off. Overall, I decided the sticker paper was causing my cuts to be even worse. I'll eventually try it again, but it really hindered my progress in cutting the glass. I know either way my cuts would have been messed up, but when I would cut and my hand would slip or get too close to that edge, I would hit the paper and it would just cause me to completely mess up. It just didn't allow me to fully learn how to make the cuts. It did have perks like being able to just pull up the pattern, or at least most of the time, and then putting it on the new glass when I did mess up. Vinyl would definitely be a lot easier to work with for something like that because it doesn't rip as easily and it would stay on significantly better than the sticker paper. But sticker paper was what I had on hand and what I could use since I could just print on it with my regular printer. Vinyl, I would just have to invest in a Cricut, or is it Cricut? I'm not really sure, but basically I would have to invest in an at-home vinyl cutting machine, which is just a whole other production, so I'm just not there yet. This was my third ever attempt with copper foil, and as you can see in the video, I was still struggling with it. I tried watching what other people did, and some people I was finding that they were laying it down like that with such ease and just lining it up. That did not work for me. I say it often, but my brain works differently, and for whatever reason, I have to see the copper foil at a certain angle. Because my camera setup wasn't quite good enough, I didn't film much of it, but I began to learn how to hold the glass so that I could evenly distribute it around it. I know that glass is supposed to be the same width, but it rarely actually is, and that tiny little bit can really mess you up. When you have a textured glass, it messes with the edges and it makes it more difficult to foil, but some of the glass is just the tiniest smidge thicker than the other glass, and when you have that very small working area, it can just mess with your brain. So it has been very difficult for me personally to learn how to copper foil properly because you're never working with the same surface. I don't have an actual foil holder, so this won't really apply if you do have one, but I found shortly after this that if you cut off some of the copper foil, it makes it a lot easier to work with because you're not fighting with the roll. It's also important to note that copper foil comes in different widths. Some of them don't seem like they're that significant of a difference, but that tiny bit, I'm telling you, can really mess you up if you end up switching rolls to something thicker or thinner. And I also found with one of my more recent projects that you will actually be able to tell with the solder. Even though it doesn't seem like it's a big difference, you will definitely be able to tell. I'm learning that every detail in stained glass can always be different. That's why it's so important to learn the technique and then you'll be able to adjust it depending on what you're working on. But that doesn't mean that it makes it a smoother process or any easier. You'll just be able to adapt. Now let's talk about copper foil and that hat with the deep curve. I didn't actually film the process of copper foiling it because I didn't have the right angle for my camera, and honestly my hands were not steady at all. But I was struggling with this. No matter what I tried, the copper foil would split, crack. I watched videos, asked questions, and no matter what technique I tried, that copper foil was going to crack. Not only was it cracking, but at this point I didn't fully understand the importance of a clean copper foil line. You will see every single crack, every single time you have less on one side and then it goes back to your regular thickness. Every imperfection is picked up by that solder when it comes to copper foil. For those who work with stained glass, you know why, but for those who might be watching this and either haven't tried stained glass yet or you're just beginning, it's because the copper is what the solder actually attaches to. If there's a crack, the solder has nothing to attach to because it's just glass beneath it. If you have an overlap, it's going to stick to that overlap because it doesn't stick to the glass and it has nowhere else to go. But I do want to say, give yourself so much grace when it comes to learning this craft. No one is going to be perfect unless you have some sort of jig that does all the work for you. But what's the fun in that? It might stink to have to go back and rip off your copper foil if it's just not working for you, or you have to go over it a bunch of times, but it is going to be worth it because you'll prevent those imperfections from coming through when it's time to solder. Other than that one hat, I think my copper foiling overall was pretty good, or at least decent. It was just that tiny little section I became so frustrated with because it kept cracking, and at this point I didn't know how to fix it properly. So I just left it, which wasn't my best decision, but it did provide a good learning experience. And now we get into soldering. Let's remember that this was one of my very first projects and I hadn't learned about too much flux being a bad thing. Don't be like me and just squirt it on there. Put some in a cup and brush it on like a normal person. I also learned that flux can be finicky. You don't want too much flux, but you may also need to add more. And learning that can be a difficult lesson because if there's not enough flux, it can rip up your copper foil and be a little bit of a headache. But from what I'm learning, you eventually figure out that amount of flux your project needs and sort of spot the signs before it's too late. The project before this one, I thought a tinned look would be good, and it was not. So this was the first project when I was really practicing true soldering and not just tinning my piece. I honestly don't think it would have turned out that bad, although there were a few spots where there are clear bumps on it and I didn't catch it and I didn't go back to smooth it. To this day, I still don't know why my edges were better during this project than they were during my current progress. I don't know if maybe my tip was just newer so the solder worked better, or I have no idea. But the beveled or beaded edge worked, and I don't know how it did because I've been practicing this currently with the actual techniques and it has not been going well. I mean, it's not great work, but as I progress in my techniques and I learn what I'm actually doing, I am amazed that I did this at all and question if maybe having no idea what to do and just figuring it out would be better than me watching other videos because those beaded edges are not for the weak. I have since grown fond of the U-came around the border of the smaller pieces, but I still practice my beaded edge because I would like to figure out how to do it properly. I'm starting to understand why people leave a true beaded edge instead of smoothing it out because that is so much easier than fighting gravity when you're trying to smooth it out. And you avoid all of that mess of those little droplets falling down and ruining your solder lines. And at this point, I honestly hadn't even thought about how to hang the piece I was making. Hooks never even crossed my mind. I was just practicing how to make it and not thinking of how to display it, so I never added anything on there. I also didn't know how to take care of the solder. I thought they looked good as silver, so I left them as is, but I didn't know that you still needed to sort of take care of that silver solder by scrubbing it, washing it, using a magic eraser on it, and even adding wax. So those steps are definitely something I would do if I were going to recreate these ones. I will say that working with smaller pieces was a great way to get started because you don't have to have a ton of glass, which for most people, when you're starting out, it's going to be so limited. But it's also not overwhelming. If I started with a larger project, I'm not sure that I would enjoy this process as much because each step needs so much attention. Being able to finish a project sooner has helped me want to continue to grow and progress in my stained glass journey, so I'm happy with the decision to start small.